In the summer of 1941, London was a city of smoke and shattered brick. The Luftwaffe had not yet broken British resolve, but the danger was constant. Amid the bomb craters, sandbag checkpoints, and the distant thrum of air raid sirens, one of the most secret and unusual operations of the war quietly began. An operation to protect not the Prime Minister himself, but a man chosen to sound like him, stand like him, and occasionally be seen in his place. The British government knew that Winston Churchill was more than a political leader. He was a symbol of defiance. His speeches, broadcast over the BBC, were a lifeline of morale for millions. Losing him, even briefly, could fracture national unity. And German intelligence was well aware of this. The Abwehr, operating through neutral ports in Lisbon and Madrid, had already circulated orders to locate the English war leader and identify vulnerabilities in his travel routine. Meanwhile, the Sicherheitsdienst had begun drafting proposals for infiltration teams to exploit the chaos of air raids. Britain had reason to fear. The assassination of a leader was not just possible, but strategically sought. It was in this atmosphere, tense and uncertain, that MI6 quietly approached Norman Shelley, a well-regarded BBC radio actor known for his precise ear and vocal control. Shelley had already performed dramatic readings on wartime broadcasts, but this request was different. He was asked to replicate Churchill's voice, exactly, unmistakably, to record speeches that could be transmitted when the Prime Minister was traveling or otherwise unable to speak live. Officially, these recordings were simply backup content. Unofficially, they were a safeguard against assassination or sudden incapacitation. Shelley was not a soldier. He had no combat training, no taste for cloak-and-dagger intrigue. He was an ordinary man invited into extraordinary secrecy, and he understood the weight of it. In a private notebook later discovered among his papers, he wrote, "To bear another man's words is a weight far greater than merely speaking them. One does not borrow a voice without borrowing also the burden behind it." MI6 arranged for Shelley to undergo training, not in combat, but in persona. They studied Churchill's cadence, the heavy pause before emphasis, the gravelly churn of a voice worn by cigars and nightly tension, the rising swell before a phrase like, "We shall fight on the beaches." They observed his posture, his slight forward tuck of the chin, his habit of leaning on a cane even when he did not need it. It was not enough to sound like Churchill, the illusion had to be total. But there was also a deeper tension. Churchill himself was aware of the plan. He did not object. But neither did he openly endorse Shelley's presence. The Prime Minister simply understood what had to be done. His chief private secretary recorded one short comment, almost offhand, almost weary. "The voice must live, even if the man does not." Yet secrecy comes with cost. Shelley's wife and closest friends were never told why he traveled so frequently, why his mood darkened, why he seemed to be living borrowed time. London was a city under siege, and even the act of moving from home to studio carried danger. The BBC broadcasting house on Portland Place was hit by German bombs in October 1940, leaving a visible scar in its facade. Engineers carried on recording even as dust and smoke drifted in the corridors. To speak in Churchill's voice during such moments was to confront the very real possibility that the words could be his last. The public never noticed. They were not supposed to. That was the entire point. But there was one night, quiet, fog-heavy, the sort that clung to lamplight and turned the Thames a flat sheet of black steel, when Shelley walked alone from the studio to a waiting car. He paused, listening. Not to the distant sirens or the echo of boots on wet pavement, but to the silence between breaths, to the knowledge that at any moment, somewhere in the city, someone might be watching for him, mistaking him for the man he was not. For in that brief moment, Norman Shelley understood something chilling. To be Churchill's voice was to be Churchill's shadow. And shadows can be hunted. The operation was only beginning. And soon, MI6 would take steps not merely to disguise Shelley, but to protect him. Because an imitation of Churchill, if discovered, could be more dangerous than the real man himself. The existence of a double created a new and immediate problem: how to protect him. If Norman Shelley were ever spotted in the wrong place, speaking too freely, traveling without escort, the secret could collapse overnight. Worse still, if German intelligence were to locate the double and assassinate him, the public might believe Churchill himself had been killed. Such a blow could shatter morale in the very heart of Britain's war effort. For this reason, MI6 escalated the operation from a vocal safeguard into a full-bodied deception and protection program. The agency requested discreet support from two key groups: Special Branch, responsible for high-profile security across London, and a select detail of the Coldstream Guards, one of the oldest regiments in the British Army. The Coldstream Guards were accustomed to protecting royalty. Now they were being asked to protect someone whose existence could not be acknowledged. Training took place in quiet, out-of-the-way rooms at the War Office and, occasionally, in the subterranean warren of tunnels beneath Whitehall that would later be known simply as the Churchill War Rooms. Shelley arrived under assumed names, escorted through service entrances, allowed to see only the portions of the bunker necessary for the illusion. He was taught how to enter a vehicle the way Churchill did, how to raise a bowler hat in greeting, how to hold a cigar as though it were part of his very hand. There were lighter details too: gestures, habits, small motions that meant everything to observers but could easily be overlooked by an imitator. The way Churchill pinched the bridge of his nose when reviewing maps. The slight rocking motion of his stance when waiting for others to finish speaking. Even the ability to appear exhausted and yet immovable, weighted by the strain of wartime leadership. But there was nothing light about the stakes. One officer assigned to Shelley, Captain Thomas Ainsworth of the Coldstream Guards, wrote in his diary, "We must guard not only a life, but an illusion. If either slips, the consequences will be felt in every home in Britain." Ainsworth and his men developed codified procedures for any public appearance involving the double. They planned 2 exit routes for every building, one obvious, one invisible. They coordinated decoy motorcars to move simultaneously through London's tight streets. They tested how quickly Shelley could be extracted during an air raid and how convincingly he could disappear into crowds. Meanwhile, Special Branch monitored the threat side of the equation. Reports showed that WWII agents operating under diplomatic cover in Ireland and Spain were collecting rumors of Churchill's comings and goings. Some of these whispers were disturbingly precise. German intelligence analysts believed that if they could determine a pattern, just one pattern, they could predict the Prime Minister's location on any given day. Which meant Shelley's movements had to be patternless. Sometimes he was driven through London at night, hidden under a blanket in the back of a nondescript car. Other times, he traveled disguised as a BBC technician, carrying cables and tool cases that contained nothing more than folded coats. The less remarkable he appeared, the safer he was. Yet secrecy has its own psychological cost. Shelley was not merely hiding from enemies, he was hiding from the people around him. Neighbors wondered why he came and went at unusual hours. BBC colleagues noticed he grew quieter, his responses shorter, his laughter thinner. A voice actor lives through the voices he performs, but this voice demanded something more: identity itself. The emotional weight pressed down, bit by bit. Shelley's notebook entries from this period become sparse, but one line stands out: "I feel myself thinning," as if speaking his words leaves less of mine remaining. Many years later, historians would note that this is the precise moment where the line between duty and self began to blur. And while the operation was working, no leaks, no sightings, no confirmed German reports, it was also becoming more complicated. The war was changing, and soon Churchill would need to appear not only on the radio, but in person, across the country, among dockworkers, soldiers, and civilians rebuilding from bombed-out streets. Someone would have to be seen. Someone who looked close enough. The plan was evolving, and the danger was growing. For the enemy was looking too, and they were beginning to suspect that the British leader they heard might not always be the man they imagined. By mid-1941, the war had shifted into a new and uncertain phase. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, had drawn global attention eastward, but for British intelligence, it signaled something more immediate. Germany was becoming increasingly desperate to find leverage against Britain itself. With the Eastern Front demanding enormous resources, a sudden, decisive blow to British morale could tilt the balance of the war. And German intelligence believed they knew exactly where to strike. The WWII expanded its network of observers across neutral territories, particularly in Lisbon and Dublin. Portugal and Ireland, untouched by the fighting, became crossroads of whispers. Diplomats, journalists, merchant sailors, and double agents trading stories over cigarettes and coffee in hotel lounges. It was in these places that rumors began to spread that Churchill was not always where he appeared to be, and sometimes he seemed to be in two places at once. At first, these were dismissed as wartime exaggerations. But when several WWII reports mentioned unusual convoy movements in London, German analysts began searching for patterns, convinced that Churchill's security routines could be mapped. They did not yet know that the British were running two Churchill schedules, one for the real man, one for the double. And the slightest misalignment could expose everything. MI6 intercepted some of these communications through the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. Early decrypts suggested that German intelligence had stationed observers in coastal towns and railway stations where Churchill occasionally traveled. One decrypted telegram read, "Report sightings of the English war leader. Any inconsistency or oddity of behavior to be logged." That phrase, oddity of behavior, alarmed the British teams protecting Norman Shelley. If Shelley faltered in public, or if he moved differently from Churchill even once, it could spark the very suspicion they were struggling to prevent. Captain Thomas Ainsworth, still responsible for the double's safety, requested additional training sessions. The sessions grew more intense. Shelley was no longer just practicing voice and posture, he was practicing presence. He learned to appear burdened but confident, irritated but resolute, weary but unstoppable. Observers often described Churchill as a man carrying the weight of history across his shoulders. Shelley had to learn how to carry that weight convincingly, even when he felt he could barely manage his own. Meanwhile, Special Branch compiled dossiers on suspected German informants inside Britain. The majority were merely opportunists, dockworkers passing rumors for small payments, hotel clerks repeating overheard conversations. But a few names were far more concerning: trained agents using coded correspondence, dead drops, and clandestine radio transmitters. Every time an agent was arrested or flipped, MI6 analysts found references to the same question: where is Churchill now? The mystery deepened in the autumn of 1941, when two separate sightings of Churchill were reported on the same day, one in London, one in Bristol. The Bristol sighting was real. Churchill had inspected bomb damage there after a devastating air raid. But the London sighting was Shelley, rehearsing for a controlled, small-scale appearance used to reassure key political allies. Only a handful of individuals understood that these sightings referred to two different men. If the WWII ever connected them, the entire illusion would collapse. One MI6 case officer wrote in a classified internal memo, "Shadows lengthen where truth grows thin. The danger is not in the double being discovered, but in the reason for his existence being understood." This was the core of the operation's peril. If Germany learned that Churchill's voice was sometimes a recording, his appearance sometimes an actor, it would not simply reveal a deception. It would imply vulnerability. That Britain needed to protect its leader because he could be struck. That morale was fragile. That the unshakable foundation of resistance was not as solid as it appeared. For morale is a battlefield, and in 1941, Britain was still fighting to hold the line. By winter, the pressure within the operation became palpable. Ainsworth reported increased surveillance near BBC studios. Special Branch suspected signal interceptions from mobile radio vans positioned illegally in London suburbs. German intelligence was circling, probing, waiting for one slip. And that slip nearly came, when air raid sirens began to wail over Liverpool. The next phase of the operation would not just test the double's performance, it would test his survival. For the war was about to bring Norman Shelley face to face with the very danger Churchill himself faced every day. And the enemy was listening. In early 1942, Churchill was scheduled to visit the shipyards of Liverpool, one of the most critical and heavily targeted cities in Britain. The port was the lifeline of the Atlantic convoys, carrying food, fuel, and munitions from North America. German U-boats prowled the surrounding waters, and Luftwaffe bombers had already reduced parts of the city to ruins. Yet Churchill insisted on appearing in person, to stand where the struggle is fiercest. But his travel posed a dangerous question. Should the double be used for supporting appearances to disguise Churchill's real movements? MI6, the War Office, and Special Branch debated the matter intensely. Intelligence reports indicated that German reconnaissance flights had recently been sighted offshore near Liverpool Bay. The Luftwaffe had increased bomb runs targeting naval dockyards, likely hoping to catch an important political figure. If Churchill were killed here, at the very edge of Britain's supply line, the psychological blow could be devastating. The decision was ultimately made. Churchill would travel to Liverpool discreetly, while Norman Shelley would perform a controlled, low-profile appearance in London the same day, maintaining the illusion that the Prime Minister was still in the capital. This required careful staging. Shelley was driven to a small industrial facility in Woolwich, where workers were told only that the Prime Minister would briefly greet them before continuing to urgent governmental matters. Photographs were prohibited. Press access was entirely forbidden. It was a delicate plan, one that relied on precision timing, disciplined secrecy, and the assumption that enemy surveillance could not track both events simultaneously. But German intelligence was already watching. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft flying above the Meuse River recorded shipyard activity matching the preparations associated with high-level visits. Anti-aircraft batteries were reinforced, security at road checkpoints tightened. These were signs that could not be easily concealed. Within hours, analysts in occupied France recommended a bombing raid. At dusk, air raid sirens wailed through Liverpool. Civilians scrambled into basements and shelters. And Churchill, standing among the shipbuilders, was quietly escorted into a reinforced bunker beneath the docks while bombs rained across the city. The ground shook with the impact of high-explosive ordnance. Fire crews struggled through shattered streets where entire rows of houses had been demolished. Meanwhile, in London, Shelley was concluding his brief appearance, unaware that the real Churchill was in immediate danger. Then word reached MI6 headquarters. German radio traffic suggested that the Luftwaffe believed Churchill might be present in Liverpool. If the resemblance between his security preparations and a real appearance were confirmed, the city could face continued bombardment, and the double could be exposed as a fraud if someone noticed conflicting reports of Churchill's presence. Captain Ainsworth reacted instantly. Shelley's escort team moved him out of the Woolwich site and into a staff car disguised among factory shipping trucks. They changed routes twice, avoiding thoroughfares and blitz-damaged streets where movements might be observed. The goal was simple: make Shelley disappear before anyone could connect two Churchills to the same day. But even perfect planning cannot account for witnesses. Several dockyard workers in Liverpool later reported that they believed they had seen Churchill twice, once among the debris, once nearer the railway yard an hour later. In truth, the second sighting was Shelley being quietly removed from London on a contingency diversion, but the rumor quickly spread among naval ratings and local militia volunteers. There are two Churchills. One for danger, one for the people. The British government ignored the whispers. Newspapers printed nothing. Official records remained sealed. But the rumor persisted. Among sailors. Among factory workers. Among veterans who swore they knew what they saw. And though the truth remained buried, the story created something unintended, something powerful. The idea that the symbol of British resolve could be in more than one place at once. Yet for MI6, this was not inspiration, it was threat. Because if ordinary dockworkers could notice the double, German intelligence might soon notice as well. And the Abwehr was already narrowing the search. By 1943, the war had entered a new and decisive phase. The United States was fully committed, the tide in North Africa was turning, and plans for future operations in Europe were being drawn in guarded rooms under London. Churchill traveled frequently now, meeting Roosevelt in Casablanca, visiting troops in Cairo, inspecting fortifications on the English coast. Each journey increased the risk to his life. And each journey raised the importance of Norman Shelley's role as the unseen double. But the longer the operation continued, the more delicate it became. Shelley could no longer be relied upon for controlled public appearances, not after the near exposure in Liverpool. Instead, MI6 restricted him to secure studio broadcasts. In windowless rooms beneath London, sound engineers recorded speeches that would later be broadcast as if Churchill had spoken them live. The goal was simple: preserve continuity. If Churchill was abroad, negotiating with Allied leaders, the British public should hear his voice at home. Yet these recordings came at a cost, one that weighed heavily on Shelley himself. He knew that Churchill's speeches were not merely words. They were emotional anchors for a country battered by nightly air raids, food rationing, and casualty telegrams. To speak them was to carry the emotional gravity of a nation at war. And Shelley felt that gravity pressing deeper with each passing month. In a rare surviving diary entry from late 1943, he wrote, "History hears a voice, not the man behind it. And yet I wonder, when the war ends, who will remember the speaker? Him or me?" Shelley was not seeking recognition. He was grappling with identity. The longer he spoke as Churchill, the more he felt himself dissolving into the role. Ordinary conversation became strained. His own tone began to mimic the cadence he had practiced. Even at home, his wife noticed a growing distance, a quietness that had not been there before. Meanwhile, MI6 faced a strategic dilemma of their own. To maintain secrecy, Shelley could never speak of his work. He could not confide in friends, could not seek guidance, could not even hint that he carried such responsibility. The isolation was complete. Only 5 individuals knew the full extent of the operation, and 3 of them rotated duty assignments every 6 months. And looming above everything was a persistent question: what would happen after the war? Would Shelley ever be allowed to speak of his role? Or would he be erased from the story entirely? Inside Whitehall, opinions differed. Some argued that the mere admission of a double would undermine the authenticity of Churchill's wartime speeches, even those Churchill delivered himself. Others believed the truth, if ever revealed, would be seen as a masterstroke of wartime deception. But the government made one thing clear: no public acknowledgement would be permitted while Churchill still lived. This secrecy, maintained for the sake of national unity, left Shelley in an emotional twilight. He was indispensable and invisible, essential and unrecognized. And yet the work continued. Shelley entered the studio once more in the winter of 1943. Snow dusted the rooftops of London. Anti-aircraft guns stood silently along the Thames. The war was changing shape, no longer defined by bombs overhead, but by the slow, grinding advance of armies across continents. He placed his hands on the script, adjusted his breath, found the tone. The red recording light blinked on. For a moment, Norman Shelley ceased to exist. Only Churchill's voice remained. The speech he recorded that night would be broadcast across the country the next morning. Thousands would listen. Many would draw strength from it. Some would weep. And not one of them would know who had spoken. Yet, outside Britain, the war continued to spread. Preparations for D-Day were underway. Churchill would need to travel again, and the risk of assassination would once more be at its highest. The double would be needed again. But this time, not everyone involved would return. When the war finally turned in the Allies' favor, much of the world heard Churchill's voice at some of its most pivotal moments. D-Day announcements, speeches of resolve during the push toward Paris, and somber words as Allied troops uncovered the full horror of the concentration camps. Some of these were Churchill's own broadcasts. Others were delivered by Norman Shelley from secure studios deep beneath London, timed carefully to match Churchill's actual movements across Europe. Only the smallest circle of intelligence officers knew when the voice was the Prime Minister, and when it was the man who stood in his shadow. By the spring of 1945, Churchill was celebrated around the world as the embodiment of British endurance. Shelley, meanwhile, returned quietly to civilian broadcasting. There were no medals, no commendations, no acknowledgments. The Official Secrets Act bound him as tightly in peacetime as it had during the war. To the public, his role had simply never existed. To speak of it would have risked undoing the unity and symbolism the war had required. The file on the double remained sealed. MI6 locked away the records, training notes, security logs, escort schedules, and the transcripts of the recordings delivered under Churchill's name. Even the Coldstream Guardsmen who had protected Shelley were placed under lifetime confidentiality. Many took the secret to their graves. In this, Britain mirrored what other Allied nations did. protect the myth that leadership is singular, clear, and wholly embodied in one visible figure. Yet secrets do not always sleep silently. In the 1960s and 70s, a handful of scholars researching wartime propaganda discovered discrepancies between speech dates and Churchill's travel schedules. There were also recollections from retired sound engineers who spoke, carefully, vaguely, of special sessions during the Blitz. And then there were the dockworkers of Liverpool, who still told their stories in shipboard canteens and union halls of seeing 2 Churchills in one day. Most historians dismissed these as the fog of memory. But some were not so sure. It was not until fragments of intelligence archives were released in the 1980s that the matter resurfaced in earnest. A single line in an MI6 personnel memo referred to the secondary orator. Another document mentioned vocal duplication contingencies. And then, most tellingly, researchers uncovered a private letter Shelley had written late in life. "I was not the lion. I only found the voice to roar." To this day, the full record remains incomplete. Some files are still classified. Some were destroyed. Some, perhaps, never existed in writing at all. And historians continue to debate where the boundaries lie. How many speeches Shelley recorded, how many appearances he nearly made, and how often he might have stood where danger was meant for someone else. The mystery has never been fully resolved, because the truth sits at a delicate intersection. The people needed Churchill. The war needed Churchill. And sometimes, the world needed something that looked and sounded like certainty, even if it came from another man. Norman Shelley died in 1980, known publicly as a respected radio actor and narrator of children's stories. Only a small handful of individuals, most of them long gone now, ever understood the weight he carried in silence. Churchill, for his part, never spoke publicly of the double, not out of denial, but because he understood what symbols mean in times of crisis. The voice that Britain heard during its darkest hours remains a testament to resilience, unity, and survival. Even if, at times, that voice belonged to someone history almost forgot. And perhaps that is the final lesson of this hidden chapter of the war. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage are the ones that remain unrecognized.